So my name is Helene Ahlborg, and the title of this talk today is Power and Imaginations, Opening Up to Our Energy Futures. I will talk about power in the dual meaning of power as social relations and power as energy, or specifically electric power. I will also talk about the role of imaginations in both research and politics, and argue for the importance of shifting from a single view to a plurality of positions and framings in order for us to open up to a broader discussion around our energy future. I've chosen this very evocative title at the same time as I've given you a photograph from a very mundane situation of a walk on a cloudy day somewhere in the countryside. This is because it illustrates for me the contrast of working with energy transitions in an East African context, where I move between very glossy images of the future energy systems and beautiful technologies and prosperity in society to the reality on the ground, where these energy transitions are supposed to take place. So here are some of these illustrations of these beautiful images for the energy future of Africa, which does in contrast to what I experience in villages on the ground, where this transition is supposed to happen and play out. Those of you who know me know I'm not a very conflict-oriented person, but as a researcher, I've come to believe that we really need to pay close attention to friction, tension, and conflicts. And recently, there's one creature who has really helped me sort of have driven home this point for me, and that is the chimera. So the chimera is this fearsome, fire-breathing female monster in Greek mythology. She has 3 heads, and her body is composed of a lion, a goat, and a serpent in one. The chimera has multiple meanings, and her origin is, of course, disputed, but the most established version is that she was terrorizing the people in Asia Minor, in the area of Lycia, which is today known as Turkey. And she was eventually slain by the hero Bellerophon on the horse Pegasus. Sighting her was considered an omen of natural disaster, or shipwreck, or volcano eruptions, and she was considered a threat to the order of the gods. She was the offspring of 2 other famous monsters, Typhoon, a monstrous serpentine giant, who was considered the deadliest creature in Greek mythology, and Echidna, who was half woman, half snake, living alone in a cave and got the dubious reputation of being the mother of all monsters. So the chimera has also come to signify any creature with multiple different body parts, and chimeras are present in everyday popular science and culture, popular culture, in fiction, in literature, in games, and movies and books. In the daily language, we speak of chimeras rather in the meaning of a thing that is hoped or wished for, but that is illusory or impossible to achieve, a fancy. But there's also a more positive connotation, and that is chimera as a vision. And some people have thought of chimeras as an illusion in terms of interdisciplinary science. I think of it as a vision for interdisciplinary work. But I will return to chimeras, but first I want to bring you to the context where I'm working, and it's mostly a Swedish audience, so I will try to give you a bit of a broad picture to give this context. So there's, of course, a scientific context to the study of energy transitions. And when I work with the question of how the transition to renewable energy systems is part or the fundament of the economy in the East African region, how that transition is going to come about and where it might take us, then there's a number of fields that are relevant. Obviously, I work within the field of energy and development, where a lot of people have theorized and tried to understand the complex causal relations between energy services and provision in society and socioeconomic development. There's also a huge literature on energy policy, what needs to be in place in terms of frameworks and regulations in order to steer the transition in the direction we're hoping for, what is necessary in order to enable the uptake and diffusion of renewable energy systems. We have a huge literature, mainly in engineering science, but also in economics, on the conditions and the design of renewable energy systems. What should they look like? How should it be designed? What should be the business models or the financing models for these systems to work in practice and be sustainable over their entire lifetimes? We have a literature on technology transfer and also a large literature with its base in science and technology studies that thinks about what it takes for these new technologies to spread in certain contexts and communities, which is also related to innovation and entrepreneurship. We have a small literature on energy anthropology that is exploring energy needs, energy provision and use in daily life of people, showing a huge diversity of what happens on the ground and the meanings attached to energy in our lives. We also have now a recent stream of thinking that we could call energy geography, where there's more attention paid to the spatial patterns of the shift from a fossil fuel-based energy system to renewable energy-based systems, which may have huge impacts for rural areas in particular, because of the land, the way that new renewable energy infrastructure will acquire and acquisition land, and they require different types of land use. Closely related to that, we have people engaging in environmental assessments to find out what are the ecological effects, or sorry, the environmental effects on ecosystems from the exploitation of renewable energy resources and the expansion of infrastructure, as well as, of course, the decarbonization aspect of reducing climate change. And there's a field called sustainability transitions, which is theorizing transitions at large. What does it take for a society to make a huge shift in some of its more fundamental sectors, where energy is one of them, but not the only one. But energy as a catalyst for other sectors, this field has a lot to contribute to our understanding of where we are going and where we could potentially end up. Then there's, of course, also aspects of political economy, because a change in the energy system also means a change in the economy, both in the East African region as well as in Sweden. I cannot say that I work primarily in one of these fields. I have had something to do with all of them. And I think it has shaped my identity as a scientist, the fact that I've had to engage with all these different fields. I've been visiting in multiple fields and I learn from all of them. And it's due to the phenomena that I study. It's such a broad process that we need to bring in all these different perspectives to understand what we see on the ground. So let me now move to the geographical context. We can say, just to give you an idea, that the broad picture is that in Sub-Saharan Africa as a region, the problem is that a large part of the population still lacks access to adequate and high quality energy services. This has consequences for everyday life and for the economy at large and for people's well-being. Also, energy services are relatively expensive as compared to people's income levels. And those people who do have access to electricity services suffer from a lack of reliability of these services. We're seeing a growing population across the continent and a steep rise in energy demand that is not being met. Zooming in on East Africa, we can see that this part, this region has been lagging behind, but there has been a big development in the recent 5 years, driven especially by 3 countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Kenya, who have improved their electricity access levels. So we are now at a 43% access level estimated. Still, people are using very little electricity in the daily life. So, and we're seeing 3 clear access gaps. The first one is that between the urban and the rural, the other between the rich and poor, and the third between women and men. In the rural setting, East African households typically rely on firewood and charcoal for their daily heating and cooking needs, and kerosene for light. But you can see a lot of local diversity in the energy sources people use. But in general, this is based on the work, energy is provided through the work of women and children, which has consequences for women's time, well-being, and life situation at large. When it comes to the electricity sector, it's on the other hand very male-dominated. Ministries, large utilities, electricity companies, as well as sort of technical work, technical professions are populated by mainly men. And what we see at the local level where electricity reach is that people tend to stay at a very low consumption level. Around, often where I've been working, as low as 20 kilowatt hour per month for a household, which is compared to Sweden, it can be a 10 or 100-fold difference. On the other hand, this is a region in rapid transformation. When we started to work in East Africa some 10 years ago, governments were still largely interested in the large investments, expanding the national grid, building new coal power plants, extracting the resources that they had. And there was relatively few actors pushing for renewable energy technologies, but even fewer working and saying that small-scale solutions had an important role to play. This has really shifted in the last 10 years. And for example, the government of Rwanda is now planning that 48% of their population will be reached by decentralized solutions. The region is also full of contrasts because there's a cultural change happening very rapidly. I can see this within people my own age whose parents still live a traditional farmer's life, whereas they are internationally oriented and networked professionals in the city and live a very different type of life than their parents. We have a flourishing of conservative missionary churches next to innovation hubs across the continent. This makes this region very interesting to work in because it's so rich of contrast and diversity that a lot of new solutions are also emerging from this part of the world. What is striking then is that we cannot speak about one energy transition. There are multiple transitions happening with extremely different starting points around the world, also within regions. It's very different between the countries in East Africa and between the urban and the rural. So we're seeing multiple pathways towards different futures, and these are emerging in parallel, which is also something we have seen, and which is a reason that it matters that we open up our imagination around the future energy system, because we could go in very different directions. This has been explored to a lot more depth by one of my colleagues, Kristina Hodgkova, together with Björn Sandén. And we have worked on possible scenarios for the future and looked into the supergrid or a smart grid or an off-grid future. What we could see is that where we come from will influence how these scenarios, how attractive they are and what they would mean in different contexts. And in the East African context, there is a history where electricity grids have been built initially by the colonial powers, and they were never intended to reach everyone, but rather they were from the beginning planned to serve the interest of the colonial elites. And later on, national governments have struggled with a dependency and have found it really difficult to make decisions around their own energy infrastructure. This is still influencing where we are today. This means we need to take context very seriously, and that leads me to the second part of my lecture, which is to focus on power. Power as relations of power and as electricity. What I've seen is that electrification processes are deeply political. And when new energy projects come with new energy infrastructure being built in villages, they tend to become arenas for local and national politics. Political interests move into these seemingly engineering-only projects. And it becomes hard for local engineers who find themselves having to negotiate and working almost as diplomats to balance different interests in the context where they are trying to just build the grid. Power then is of course both a natural phenomena, but it's also that we can harness through our use of technology, that we can capture and harness in order to do work, and with astonishing effects in our ability and capacity to influence the world. Power is of course also a social phenomena, a relation, and a pattern in society. I started my work many years ago with the question in my mind: how do relations of power shape and are reshaped in energy transitions? I wanted to understand at the macro level, what were these spatial patterns of inclusion and exclusion of people and places? Why was the development done in a certain way? What informed those decisions? And what did it mean for the people in the countryside who were often left out of the plans of expansion? But I also wanted to really go down to the micro level of the everyday life to think about how social hierarchies of gender, class, age, ethnicity, religion perhaps, how these social hierarchies were influencing who got access, who could use electricity, and with what effects in daily life. I was interested in understanding this because I wanted to see when could things change, when could power relations become destabilized? What were the points of leverage? Was there any opportunities for a more just development, for a broader distribution of benefits, and a more fair sharing of costs? So I've been working with my colleagues on a set of questions related to power, development, and institutions. One reason is that electricity is a very, very important symbol for modernity and progress. And there has been a tendency to treat electricity projects or electrification projects as neutral welfare projects that benefit each and every one and that no one should oppose because they're so good. This is a very naive understanding, and it's also not taking seriously the concerns that people have, which includes aspirations to a better life that are very legitimate. It also overlooks the local politics, where there's a lot of things going on within households and within communities that we need to understand in order to understand the effects and to what extent bringing electricity could actually catalyze change in the community. We've also been working around institutions to a large extent because institutions stabilize existing social hierarchies, but they can also be leverages for change. They can also leverage change. We've been working with case studies of a number of off-grid electrification projects. I've been problematizing the idea that access is just getting electricity in your house and then you have access. We need to really look more carefully at what does it mean? What can you do? To what extent can you maintain your access over time, and who controls the access of others? So I've asked the questions, what do energy projects do? What effects do they produce? And since we were interested in not just describing failures or exclusion, we also wanted to see, were there strategies to make things work better? How can you constantly improve on the projects you engage in and the processes you're trying to direct? So we have had a project focusing on islands of success, considering the fact that the institutional context can be challenging with low levels of trust, widespread corruption, and high levels of poverty. We've been thinking about strategies of enforcement in balance with establishing trust and achieving participation, democratic participation. And how does that balance with corruption? So we learned a lot about the dynamics at the micro level, and these have consequences for the viability and sustainability of local utility organizations, that is the providers of electricity, because they have to negotiate and deal with the politics in the local context. They need to establish a good working relationship with their users. And this has led us to propose also some new design approaches where we're trying to achieve both gender-sensitive designs and more flexible and adaptive designs in order to ensure high-quality services over the entire lifetime of electricity systems. Still, this doesn't answer the question of what is power and how does it really work in these processes. So in recent years, I've had to engage with this huge literature on power, which can be quite scary, given how many thick books have been written by famous philosophers on the topic. Returning to some of that literature, I found that in the European tradition, which is where I am myself based, and which was my starting point, the etymology of power, Kraft, Macht, Puissance, Pouvoir, Potere, these are words that work both as nouns and as verbs. They refer to the force of something, but also the capacity to do. And this dual meaning has really been important for me. If we think of power as capacity, it's been focused on human agency and intention. And there's a huge literature discussing that. One definition I like is that having power is being able to make or receive any change or to resist it. What we do find, however, is that there are some contradictions, because within this understanding of power and capacity, some people think of power as relational, always relational, whereas others think of power more as a resource that can be more or less unequally distributed in society. Something you can hold, something you can have. It's more thing-like, if you want. A way to map then the different understandings of power is to think about power as capacity is called power to. But within this, we have the focus on power over, power as dominance. And I would say that that's where most of the attention has been placed. There people talk about power as repressive, as conflictual, sometimes as a radical oppression. But feminist theory has contributed these very crucial insights around other aspects of power, the other phase of power, which is power with or power from within, where we can talk about empowerment, a productive collective power, and even consensual power, and nurturing power. Then there's an older tradition and a different tradition, so to speak, that considers power as a right, sometimes given by God to the king, sometimes based on a good government, a legitimate power or the rule of law, which is more formalized into various processes that establishes power as right. If we think a little bit more about power to, power as capacity, there is power over, the dominance aspect, and the empowerment aspect. And these are, I find, always in tension. Still, this doesn't capture the other idea of power as a force of things. That comes instead and has been developed by, in the wake of the work by Foucault, who has inspired a huge literature to understand power as constituting social relations, human and non-human interactions, which is a much more elusive understanding of power. because there we shift away from a focus of human agency and intention to wider forces and pressures that emerge from a multitude of interactions, if you want a more systemic understanding of power. This type of power can be seen as emerging from different things. It could be seen as being embodied in an artifact, or emerging at the level of networks or assemblage or systems. My contribution here has been to think carefully about these two different conceptions of power and try to bridge between them, because clearly for the study of electricity systems in East Africa, I've seen that they are both relevant and help me make sense of what I see. But how could I bridge between them? Because there was like a lack of communication and a lot of philosophical incoherency in how people were writing about this. I turned to feminist theory again, where I've learned a lot about power, because it's really so that this tension between empowerment and dominance is something that feminists have captured. Because, and what they also show is that this tension produces very contradictory and ambiguous effects. It creates uncertainty, if you want. We can see also that social relations and hierarchies need to be reproduced. They need to be performed and established through practices, because if people stop maintaining them, they can fall apart quite fast, and surprisingly so. Another aspect of power that I've learned from especially ecological feminist thinking is that power is embodied and embedded. It is something that emerging in relation with people, other animals, natural and built environments. So it's not a question of human agency only. What I've done then together with my colleagues is to conceptualize power as relational, situated and embodied practice. This means that we see human agency and constituted power as interplaying and in tension with one another. And what we want to focus on depends on our analytical objectives. So we may need to shape our frameworks to study power differently depending on what we're trying to understand. And that's probably very important. So there cannot be a final conceptualization or definition of power. It needs to be a living concept. What I've seen then in my own work is that power emerges from this encounter between infrastructures and local contexts. And I have identified particular sources when destabilization or stabilization happens. So to speak, moments or locations where effects are produced. And I will give you a couple of examples. The role of technology in this, we've also worked to understand the role of technology and to think about how technology works as an intermediary between humans and our environments. And it's very important because it critically changes the scale of those relations. It extends in time and space our relationship to nature and our capacity to influence and affect change. But it's also very ambivalent. Again, we have this ambivalence where power exercises are also contested and responded to. So it's an ongoing process. Even if my intention is to dominate, I may not be successful because other people and nature around me may respond in unexpected ways. We can also see that infrastructures embody the power exercise of engineers and designers, and they regulate human behavior by encouraging, forbidding, allowing certain types of uses. But the script, these are not stable, and users tend to misbehave and change and modify infrastructure and designs. Andrew Feinberg has said that the technologies today, they manifest the unequal power relations in the world. And he says that a different power structure would innovate a different technology. And indeed, it already does. We can see this happening. And that's why there's always this potential for technology to be part of establishing and mediating more caring and nurturing relations and more reciprocity. So that potential is always there. So what are those locations of power then? So let me just give an example. I mean, of course, the power grid has a spatial outline, which means that there are certain spatial places, some certain locations where we can access this resource that can transform our capacity to do work. That's one thing. We can also think of what an electrification project does. So a project, as it comes in, as we start to build a new energy system, there's a certain cyclical process to it. And the main stabilizing force that sort of just reproduces social hierarchies, even when a new resource, even when electricity comes, things will remain largely the same. The main stabilizing force lies in the existing distribution of resources, the current division of labor, often very gendered, the decision-making influence, which is often also very gendered, and dominant discourses and institutions. These kind of constrain and work against change. But the external system, the sort of new resource and system that comes in, that is being created, can also come, it comes always with a logic and a certain process. And that can align with or contest the existing social order. So for example, if we come in with pro-poor and gender-sensitive approaches and try to really ensure participation of more marginalized groups, we are already contesting dominant discourses and hierarchies. The technology scripts also regulate user behaviors, and this can be exemplified by prepaid meters, where prepaid meters mean that everyone has to pay before they can use electricity. And this stops the local village chairman from free riding and using electricity for free and then refusing to pay his bills. So it also has, it also sort of contests social hierarchies. We can also see examples of people supporting one another, engaging to help their neighbors, provide access to others, work in groups as collectives to enable a broader access than only for those who manage to pay for a connection in their home. And then we see that people do gain, as they start using electricity, their productive power change. There is a shift in the relationship between time, labor, and resources. And this in itself destabilizes the local economy. There's a moment where things have to be renegotiated. And there can be shifts in both discourse on what is valuable and knowledge changes. We see effects in changing work organization, a change in people's mobility patterns, their communication patterns, how they are connected to the outside world, and how they use everyday space, the time they spend in the village center, the time they spend at home, how long they stay up at night, what they do at certain times of the day. Over time, this leads to these many small changes and shifts lead to also shifts in people's identities and the meaning of places and spaces. Over time, we do see material and social repositioning happening as a result of electrification, both of individuals who see their social mobility enhanced and the community's place in the world. Still, however, the overall pattern remains in place with social hierarchies that are being very difficult to change. Gender and class relations tend to remain very strongly in place. If we zoom out, we have theorized this as 4 locations where power emerges. It's in and where change can happen. It's in the knowledges and ontologies. It's in the system configurations on the ground. It's in the access and entitlements. And it's in the everyday lives of people. Another example of this is some work we've done in an urban setting. where my colleague Pauline Chirunia and Professor Bernard Truffer, they have, together with them, I worked on urban transitions in informal settlements of Nairobi, where we see a huge complexity in everyday life and basic service provision, where the city has in its built environment manifests inequality and this colonial heritage of unequal service delivery. What we find there is that we cannot really speak of an energy sector or a water sector. Instead, we have multiple, partly overlapping and quite fragmented service systems in place, with two neighborhoods just nearby having very different access to these services. So people in the informal settlements, they may have lines passing over their heads, but they cannot access them unless they are willing to steal electricity at the risk of their lives. They may have water pipes and drainage systems, but sometimes the government closes off, or the city government closes off water to an entire neighborhood. And people need to buy drinking water from small plastic bags because the water they have in the community at the taps is not clean. Here we have used practice theory to understand, in particular, sanitation practices and the room for innovation, because we are trying to find those points of leverage. What could be changed? What we learned from doing that using rich ethnography and this understanding of people being embedded in a daily environment. We have learned that there's so much change that people and uncertainty that people have to negotiate and deal with, that they develop a whole portfolio of solutions just in order to be able to go to the toilet on a daily basis. And this has implications for the type of innovations that can work for people. And it also means that we need to think about these people as the experts of the local context and as co-creators. And often they are the service providers, but of informal services. So what's next? So we're going to bring this into some of these insights into a new program in Rwanda that we have started around a year ago. In this program, we will have 6 PhD students active and 3 postdocs. We have lots of seniors, both on the Rwandan side and the Swedish side, and some postdocs will probably come into this as well, also on the Swedish side. We're going to work together as a big team to explore various pathways for Rwanda's future energy system. We will work with multiple different energy sources, different system sizes, decentralized and on-grid solutions, microgrids and standalone systems. I will, I will be more engaged in 2 different projects, one on the energy geography of Rwanda, trying to understand the spatial patterns of inclusion and exclusion in the current, but also in the potential futures with the different trajectories, and think about the consequences and trade-offs. We will also work with a very strong attention to user innovation and co-creation processes in the everyday lives of energy use in households. Our vision is to create an interdisciplinary program that can provide and respond both to Rwanda's unique challenges and possibilities. We want it to be experimental and transdisciplinary, an emphasis on real-world case studies. And we have to take seriously the fact that how we frame our research has an implication for what we can see. Therefore, we need to have multiple framings. So we will work with multi-scale assessment, mixed methods, and pay attention to power. This leads me to the last summing up of this lecture. I want to say something more about power and knowledge making, because it's such a crucial aspect. How we frame our research, how we formulate our research problem will have, and the methods we choose to work with, that will have a direct consequence for what we can see and what answers we can come up with and what we will provide, suggest to be solutions. This is a critical aspect of all research. We cannot solve it. We can only take responsibility for it. And I believe that the interdisciplinary process is very helpful in the sense that it tends to come with a lot of friction and misunderstandings among team members. And often we find we need to make our implicit assumptions visible in order to be able to move forward. Methodologically, this demands the multi-scale analysis and mixed methods that I was speaking about. This also leads me back to the chimera. So I've already shared with you the story of the original monster, the chimera. And I've mentioned the tension between the chimeras as a thing we hope for, but we cannot achieve them, and a vision. And what you should know is that real chimeras exist. There are biological chimeras. These are organisms containing a mixture of genetically different tissues. And this has turned out to be much more present in nature than previously thought. In fact, chimeras embody this plurality and different genetics that coexist peacefully in one body. As a researcher working in an interdisciplinary team, I think this has a really important, this tells me something really important. And the first insight for me is that we have focused too much on hybrids. We have sought too much consensus. We don't need to do that. A chimeric approach to science is to embody plurality and not strive to always find the shared language, the shared definition, or the consensus on what we mean by this word. Instead, we want to engage with plural ontologies, plural ways of seeing the world, plural ways of knowing, and insist that we must therefore also work with plural methodologies. We should enjoy the translation between different languages. I think of the interdisciplinarity as becoming a polyglot, learning different languages. I'm not seeking to develop a Swinglish version. Instead, I'm interested in learning fluently both Swedish and English and being able to work in both languages without too much difficulty. As we shift between these different disciplinary languages, we find that within each discipline, there are multi-layered meanings for the same concept. And as we move between disciplines, meanings really change. This does not need to scare us or make us feel it's hopeless. Instead, there should be, this is where new insights emerge. So we don't need to solve the disciplinary tensions. We don't need to throw out discipline. Instead, we can just leave those tensions and think of them as productive. And this is the same as moving from a single imagination of the future to opening up to plurality of future views. And it's important because it's a really important counter to dominant paradigms, dominant norms, and dominant ways of thinking that tend to silence other ways of knowing and new ideas. So a chimeric approach exposes and questions underlying assumptions, because that in itself is a really important exercise. It questions power relations and agendas in order to imagine other ways of doing and being, both in the energy sector and in research itself. And this also requests that we display care, listening, and reciprocity in our work practices. And you may be happy to know that biological chimeras, as well as the imaginary ones, are fertile. They reproduce. And perhaps the biological chimeras display less internal tension than we do within our interdisciplinary teams. That is fine, because I think it's a productive space in the making where we will enjoy sparks of inspiration, new imaginations, and new questions to be discovered. And with that, I want to say thank you to all my co-authors, my mentors, my colleagues around the world, my PhD students and postdocs. I'm so grateful. And I also want to say thank you to the people who have hosted me and generously shared their time and thoughts with me over the years. Thanks a lot.